Welcome to Budget Beauty, where I help you look flawless for less. Welcome back, and a very special welcome if you're new here. My name is Jen, and this is Budget Beauty. Today, per your request, by popular demand, we are doing an eyeshadow palette collection. I have a lot of palettes, and we're gonna go through them all. I'm going to share with you why they remain in my collection after my massive declutter. So if you're excited, give this video a big, huge thumbs up. Subscribe if you're not, because I upload lots and lots of new videos every single week. I won't be linking everything down below. There's just way too many palettes, but I am going to share with you my entire collection. Down in the description box, you will find my favorite beauty boxes, all of the makeup that I'm wearing in today's video, if you'd like to recreate this look, and come on over, follow me on TikTok for a little bit more beauty on a budget. So let's jump into my eyeshadow palette collection. I'm going to go ahead and start with my Oden's Eye palette. I have quite a few, starting with the Verdandi palette. I love this palette. It is so beautiful. I love the color story. Very unique to my collection, and it's the only 5-pan palette that I have from Oden's Eye. And I have the collab palettes with the creators. This is the Fancy Face here on YouTube, the Hummingbird palette, and I absolutely love this palette as well. I love the color story, the purples, the blues. It's absolutely stunning, and the multi-chromes, duochromes in here are so nice. Also from that same creator collab, I have the Giant Wolves. This is with Annette's Makeup Corner here on YouTube. Again, absolutely beautiful color story. I love the cool tones of this, and again, the multi-chromes, duochromes. Oden's Eye just does those so well. I also have the Hella palette, which was a collab with Angelica Nyquist here on YouTube. I absolutely love this palette. It is so earthy and so grungy. I love the greens, the mustard yellows. I have used this palette a ton. She did such a great job with this palette. One of the Christmas palettes for this year is the Christmas Eve. I also really love this. Again, the cool tone. I have really gotten into cool tones this last year. Now, I will always love a warm tone palette, but the cool tones, they're getting me. And this palette, again, the formula and everything is so spectacular. And I have the Merry Christmas palette. These two were released together for holiday 2022. So I almost didn't buy them both, and I am so glad that I decided to go ahead and pick them both up, because I have used these a ton, and every time I think of doing a warm Christmassy holiday look, I instantly think about these two. And the last Oden's Eye palette I have is the Soul Mane 2. This one came out this year too, and this one knocks it out of the park. I love the color story. You guys know I love colorful shadows. I have actually gotten more into neutral shadows this year, so I like that these palettes have a mix of both, and the formula of this one is probably the best Oden's Eye has put out. I have two palettes from Lethal Cosmetics, and they're both from Teresa Is Dead. She's one of my favorite beauty YouTubers. This is the Lethal Is Dead. This is actually the first palette that she collaborated with Lethal Cosmetics on, and I love it. I love the color story. It is Teresa in a palette. Same with the second palette that she did with Lethal. This is Teresa Is Lethal. And again, I love the color story. It is 100% Teresa. And this silver right here is literally the prettiest silver. It is so sparkly. And we're not going to swatch a lot, but look how sparkly and beautiful that silver is. She, again, just knocked it out of the park with this palette. Moving on to Shroud Cosmetics. Again, I only have two, and these are collaborating here on YouTube with Batty Bean. This is the It's Freakin' Bats palette. I love this palette with every fiber of my soul. It is so grungy and so incredibly delicious. I love this deep, dark kind of purple shade, the grungy greens, the mustard yellows. I absolutely love this palette. And then this year she released Hollow Bean with Shroud. And again, I love the color story of this too. This just screams fall, screams Halloween to me. And the formula is really, really nice. Now we'll get into the palettes of my very, very favorite indie brand in the entire world. That is Unearthly Cosmetics, or what used to be Alien Cosmetics. So first I have the Thirst palette. This was a palette that was released in her Halloween mystery box. Her Halloween mystery box was so incredible. Limited edition products, new products that you don't have in your collection, including 3 of these little quads, starting here with Thirst. This is the more red leaning quad. Everything about Unearthly Cosmetics, I love. The formula, the quality of the shadows, the pigmentation, all-time favorite brand ever. I will forever purchase every palette that they put out. The other one in the mystery box for Halloween is the Creepy Crawly palette. This one is so cute with the greens. And again, this chartreuse is absolutely stunning. And lastly, in the Halloween collection was the Chilling palette, which is her purple palette. This is so beautiful. Every time I wear this palette, I just get a ton of compliments. I did hear that she may be bringing back some of these Halloween palettes, so definitely stay tuned. So this is one of her new palettes. This is the Grind, kind of modeled after the Daily Grind. This palette is really, really beautiful. I will say that I wish there was one deeper matte just to really deepen up the outer corner. I find that I have to go with these two, which in my opinion are even just a little bit more mid-tone than really a deep dark, but I do love the orange color story. I wear a lot of orange. You'll see that some of my palettes do say Alien Cosmetics. Like I said, Unearthly used to be Alien, and then they rebranded this last year to Unearthly. And this is the Lure palette. I have to say, this is probably one of my favorite palettes in my entire collection. I love this middle shimmer shade right here. Absolutely incredible. I love the color story of this, the blendability. This is such a great palette. Next up is the Bunnies palette. She actually reformulated this one, and I did pick it up this year. It's not my favorite only because, again, it's pretty mid-tone. There's not a lot of depth to this palette. However, whenever I'm thinking springy pastel look, this is the first one I'm reaching for because, as always, the quality is so good. Next is the Poison Apple palette. Oh my gosh, I love this palette so much. I love all the depth in here. Such a unique, fun color story. I find that I can create looks really easily with this palette. Next up is the Witching Hour palette. This was her Halloween release in 2021, and I love this palette. I actually wore this palette for Halloween this year. I really love it. It is so fall. It is so grungy. It is so Halloween. I love the chartreuse, and I like too that you can create looks by the row. She does a really good job of laying her palettes out in a really easy to use format. We have the Fairy Frolic palette. This one I've had for quite a while, back when it was Alien Cosmetics. And again, I'm obsessed with this color story. It is so grungy. I love me a good chartreuse green, like I've mentioned, and she just does them so well. And again, I find a lot of inspiration when I'm reaching for this palette. We have the Fall Magic palette. This was her fall release last year, and it just screams fall. It's a beautiful palette. Again, really nice, solid formula. There's quite a few shimmers in this palette. It's a pretty even matte shimmer ratio, which I like because it's just easy to create a multitude of looks. Here's another one of the Halloween releases this year. This is the Weirdos palette. I have to tell you, I am obsessed with everything about this palette. I love this palette so much. I actually had to get on a pre-order for this. I didn't care how much it cost. I didn't care how long I had to wait, but I had to get this palette, and I have used it so many times. Honestly, this is probably my favorite palette from Unearthly that I have in my collection. We have the Sleepover palette. I also really love the color story of this. It's a very berry toned palette, but it's so unique. It has such deep grungy shades of berry. I know that that seems like it doesn't go together, but it really truly is such a beautiful berry purple palette. Really easy to use. You can also pop the pans out and move them around if you want to redistribute how your palette is set up. Strawberry Milkshake. It took me a while to pick this up. I had to do some research on YouTube, find some tutorials to figure out if I could make this palette work for me, and I really like this palette. I love making just strawberry toned looks with the pinks and the greens. I love the pop of yellow in the middle, and again, just amazing quality. Leather and Lace. I was so excited when she released this palette because this is a color lover, neutral lovers combinational dream. It is such a beautiful palette. I love, again, how she laid everything out in rows, so it's really easy to create looks with this. I love that there's greens, there's neutrals, there's berry tones. This is another palette palette I reach for a lot. The Not Normal palette, another one I love. The color story of this one, so unique to my collection, and anytime I want just a really grungy look, I pick up this palette, and I have created some amazing looks with this. There are so many color variations of looks that you can do, and again, amazing, amazing formula. I can't say that enough. Hauntingly Glamorous. This is another really, really, really fun color story. I love how deep this goes. There's some pastel shades, there's some mid-tone, there's some deep. They have just some really fun shades. Again, the chartreuse, the purple, the blue, this red berry color here is absolutely beautiful. This is another one that I get a lot of inspiration when I go to use it. Dead of Night palette. This actually just came out. I've only used this palette once since I received it, but holy moly, do I love it. I absolutely love the color story. It is so deep, dark, and grungy, and the shimmers in here are phenomenal. I mean, all her shimmers are phenomenal, but these ones have my heart. Next up is the All I Ever Wanted palette. These are her all shimmer, all special shade palettes. I also love these. This one, you can see she's got a lot of use. I actually take this a lot when I travel with one of my all matte palettes that I'll be sharing with you guys next, my favorite all matte palette. But these are all shifty duochrome, multi-chrome shadows. I love the All I Ever Wanted palette. So I also have the All I Ever Wanted 2. Now this one was released this year and equally as beautiful as All I Ever Wanted 1, just completely different sparkly, shimmery, duochrome, multi-chrome shades. This one, I love the golden yellows in here and the greens in here. These two all shimmer palettes are really all you need with a good matte palette. The Vitality palette, this is another one that came out this year, and this one took me by surprise. I actually like this palette a lot more than I thought that I would. It is a rainbow palette with a twist. It does go deep and dark and grungy, and the colors in here, they pair so nicely together. Again, everything's laid out in rows to create easy looks. This one definitely is a home run. Smells Like Holiday Spirit. This came out holiday last year, and I did not buy it when it was first released. I actually bought it when it went on a really good mega sale, and I'm really glad that I did. I passed over it at first just thinking I wouldn't love the color story, but I really do love it, and I have created some absolutely gorgeous looks with this palette. And lastly, from Unearthly is the In the Dark palette. This was her deep, dark, grungy palette that was released last year. Obsessed. This is probably my second favorite palette in my collection. I love the In the Dark this year, but this one is kind of the sister to that, just has some different deep, grungy, dark shades, and every time I wear this palette, I get just a ton of compliments. Moving on to my Blend Bunny palettes. Blend Bunny is another one of my favorite indie brands. This is their all matte palette, The Blends. So this is the palette that I said that I love to pair with my All I Ever Wanted palettes. This one and the shimmer palette is all you need. I have used this palette so much. I take this when I travel. This is the only palette I brought with me on my move from Washington to Arizona. The formula is amazing. Blend Bunny has some really great formulas and very pigmented colors. This year they released the Surge palette. I really like this palette too. It is really fun. It is everything from pastels to midtones to neons. The neons in this palette, this bottom row, I use it all the time. Anytime I want a neon, this is what I'm reaching for, especially this fun kind of chartreuse shade down here. This palette, incredible. I also released the Primal palette this year. This is kind of the sister to the Blends palette. This one does have some shimmers in it though. This whole row right here is all shimmers. And then you have a big white and black at the bottom, but it's just the rest of what wasn't in the Blends palette. And I really like this. This is one I reach for a lot. Next up is the Dollhouse. This is such a beautiful palette. I love it. Big palette with everything from dusty pinks to dark, deep shades, 2 rows of shimmers that go with everything. You can create some just really beautiful looks with this. And this is a really great palette if you want one with a lot of depth that is neutral with a pop of color. And last but not least is their most recent release. I have all the Blend Bunny palettes. Everything they've released I've showed you. This is their All Done Up palette, and I really like this one too. This is definitely a neutral leaning palette with a twist. I love the pastel row, the mid-tone row, the deep row, and the shimmers in this palette. absolutely strikingly beautiful. Next up is Glamlight, starting with the Chocolate Martini palette. This actually came out this last year, and I like this. I actually bought this as a neutral palette, and this is one of the neutral palettes in my collection I reach for a lot. I really like Glamlight's shimmer and matte formula. And the other palette I picked up from the Happy Hour collection is the Martini, the Dirty Martini. This is beautiful. It is green. It is grungy. This is another palette I actually reach for quite a bit. This year they launched the Scooby-Doo collection. These palettes were only $20 and the quality is absolutely amazing. This is the Creeps and Crawls. It is a purple, pink, blue color story. And again, the formula, so good. And then I have the Rutro Reggae palette, and this is their more blue, green, purple palette. I love both the Scooby-Doo palettes. I think they nailed it with the formula and the color story. This was their newest launch. It's the Strawberry Shortcake palette. I had to have this for nostalgia, but also because I think the color story is really beautiful. It is pinks, it's greens, and again, if it is the typical formula from Glamlight, I haven't even had a chance to play with this palette. I know that I'm going to be reaching for this a lot. This is their kind of rainbow pastel leaning palette. The quality of this is really nice, and whenever I'm thinking of a pastel leaning rainbow palette, I automatically reach for this one. This one is older. It was released a long time ago, but I still find that I get a lot of use out of it. Now let's move on to Adept Cosmetics, another one of my favorite indie brands. This is the Amit New palette. Oh my gosh, their formula, their shimmers, everything about Adept is million out of 10. This is another brand I usually buy everything that they release. I mean, their special shades are so spectacular. And the mattes just get better and better as they put out more palette. I also have their Kodian palette. This one is so beautiful. I reach for this one a lot. I actually reach for my Adept palettes a lot. I really love their very unique color stories, and like I said, their special shades are what really sets them apart. This is the Ninhydrin palette. Honestly, this is the one I probably use the most. I really like that the mattes in here are neutrals because they go with everything in the palette. So it's really easy for me to create looks with this palette. I think that's why I reach for this one and the next one I'm going to show you. Those are the two I reach for the most. And that one's my Heather Austin palette. This was released this year from YouTuber, beauty content creator Heather Austin. I reach for this palette a lot too because she put the perfect mattes in here, and there's several mattes, so it's really easy to create just beautiful looks. It is so grungy, and the shimmers in here are amazing. I have the Plain Jane palette. Now they just redid this one and called it the Plain Jane Remastered, but I have the original Plain Jane, and this is an all shimmer palette, so I don't reach for this one as much. I generally go for my All I Ever Wanted from Unearthly, but the shimmer shades in here are absolutely beautiful. I definitely need to reach for this one more. And lastly, from Adept is the House of Elle. This is their rendition of the Superman palette. I love this palette. I have so much fun creating looks with this. It's so unique. It's so fun. And the shimmers in here, they're so beautiful. This palette does lack a teeny bit of depth for the outer corner because you're really limited to just these couple of shades, which really are more mid-tone, but I still really love all the looks that I've created with this. I have only two Sydney Grace palettes. I like Sydney Grace, but for some reason, their releases just don't make me race out to buy them. But the two palettes I do have, I love, starting with the Tiny Marvels palette. This is the palette that Mel Thompson here on YouTube put out a few years ago. She tragically passed away unexpectedly this last year. So not only do I love the palette she created, but I keep this in memory of her. This is a beautiful palette. This is another one when I wear it, I get a lot of compliments. And the other Sydney Grace palette I have is the Enduring Love, and I keep this one because it is more of a neutral palette from Sydney Grace. Their formula is really nice, and I do love that they've popped in, you know, some blues and some pizzazz into an otherwise cool toned neutral palette. I also have two palettes from Ace Beauté. Since they reformulated, it is so much better. It's just a brand that I just don't run out to buy, but when they do release something I like, I grab it. The Falling For You palette is really beautiful. This was their fall palette that they put out, I believe, last year, and I do like this. I actually did a fall look with this palette this year, and since they've redone their formula, it's really nice. And this palette I love. This came out last year. This is the Tropical Vibes. I mean, this is is so grungy, so amazing. I love all the mustardy yellow chartreuse colors in here. This palette, the quality, million out of 10. Moving on to my Nomad palettes. I actually have quite a few. I did declutter one in my declutter video. If you haven't seen that, I'll link it down below for you. But this is the Nomad Hudson Valley. And this palette actually came out this year. This was their fall release and I love it. I love everything about it. It is so fall. It's so absolutely beautiful. The only thing I wish is that the shimmers were a little bit brighter. It's just kind of a deeper, darker palette. I think they could have really used some lighter shimmers. Next up is the Iceland Fire and Ice palette. I absolutely love this palette. It is so beautiful. The blues and the greens in here are so incredibly amazing, and the shimmers are perfection. This palette also came out this year, and I'm gonna completely slaughter the name. It is the Fêtes de Provence. I knew I wouldn't say that right, but this is such a pretty palette. I actually like that this one goes deep because we have these deep dark mattes in the corner. The palette that I decluttered from Nomad, that was my complaint with them, is that it just didn't go very deep and dark, and this one definitely does. This was the first palette I purchased from Nomad, and this is what made me fall in love with the brand. This is the American Parks palette. Again, greens, browns, neutrals. For a neutral palette, this one definitely has some twists with the shimmer shades. It's absolutely beautiful, and this one I have reached for a lot. This is another one of my favorite palettes, Whistler's Snow Lodge. This again is that cool toned kind of blue palette. I love all the depth. I love, love, love the shimmers in this palette. And again, you can go by rows and create just really pretty, easy looks. And lastly, my Nomad Haunted Europe palette. This was actually their Halloween release last year, and I have not used this enough. This is actually a really, really nice palette. I definitely need to get more use out of it. Again, I love how grungy it is and how deep in depth it goes. Deep in depth it goes. Next up is Natasha Denona. I actually have quite a few Natasha Denona palettes, some of their small ones. This is the Bebo palette. This came in one of Natasha's like little holiday kits that she did. For a neutral palette though, I really like it, and it's just super easy to create looks. I also have the little mini retro palette. Again, I think this came in one of her little holiday kits. I also have some of her larger 5-pan palettes. This one I believe is the Cupid's palette. This came from BoxyCharm, or I would not have this palette. I've actually not purchased any of these full price. They've all came in subscription boxes, but I do actually really enjoy the color story of this one. This one also came in BoxyCharm. This is the Jubilee palette. I thought for the longest time this was a black, but it is not. It is a navy. I never reached for this palette. I need to give it a little bit more love. It made it through the declutter this year, but if I don't give it a little bit more love, it's certainly not going to make it through next year. And lastly, I have the Ayana palette. This is a very neutral 5-pan palette. Again, this one needs a little bit of extra love. Now her small little 5-pans, I did purchase these. This is the mini bronze. I really like this palette. I've actually taken this traveling a couple times. It's a perfect travel neutral palette. And what I like about these two is it's really crazy to put together eye looks. And this little mini guy is probably my favorite. This is the mini Metropolis. I don't own the big Metropolis, but I really love this green shade right here. And that's what prompted me to pick this up when she did release it. And I've actually used this palette a lot and really like it. I do have two of her midi palettes. I have the Love palette. These are like $70 palettes. That's why I don't buy a lot of Natasha Denona. It's definitely a higher price point, and I don't think the quality warrants the price tag. I did get this one on a massive sale. I don't reach for it a ton, but it is really nice quality, and because it was on a good sale, I added it to my collection. And this one came out this year. This one I did pay full price for. Actually, I might have got this at the Sephora sale. This is the My Dream palette, and I actually really like this. It is cool tone neutrals, and the quality of this one I feel like is really nice. And when I'm thinking of cool tone neutrals, I do think about this one. So I do actually get a lot more use out of this. Next up are my Beauty Bay palettes. Beauty Bay palettes are so affordable. These are all under, I believe, the $20 price point. This one came out last year. This is their Wilderness palette. Oh Oh my gosh, I love this palette. This palette made it into a lot of people's top palettes of last year. It is such great quality and the color story is so fun and so inspirational. The new Mood came out this year and I also really enjoyed this palette. It is a kind of rainbow palette, definitely a more colorful palette. You do have this whole top row of neutrals and then this deeper brown neutral. I love the periwinkle purples in here and the yellows. This has been a really fun palette to use. The Age of Opulence came out last year and this is another palette that I really, really like. I just love the color story. The purples, the blues, the golds. This is another one that when I open it up, my heart kind of skips a beat and I get really excited to play with it. And lastly is Dark Fantasy. This came out this year too, and of course I had to have it. I mean, look at the color story. Deep, dark, delicious, grungy colors. Really, really nice quality, and another one I reach for a lot. Next up are my melt palettes. I have just a couple. I decluttered, I think one in my declutter video. I have the Gemini 2. I actually bought this year when it was released. They redid this palette and I love it. I will say, I wish it had some lighter shimmers. The shimmers in here are so dark. This whole palette is just really, really dark. So I'm hoping that if they ever put out another Gemini palette that they lighten it up just a little bit. And then I have the Melt Amore Mariposas. This was their holiday release last year. I did not buy it because it was ridiculously expensive, and then it went on a massive, massive sale, so I picked it up on sale, or I would not own this palette. I actually do really like it, and I've used it a lot and created some really fun looks. I have two palettes from Laura Lee Los Angeles. I have the Nudie 2. I did declutter my Nudie Patootie palette, only because I only need one of these. I don't reach for them a lot. They're very, very neutral, and I decided to go ahead and stick with the smaller palette, and I think I just prefer the color story of this one as well. And then I have my Candy Skies palette. This was her collab with her niece Erin, and this is her spin on a pastel palette. I actually really, really like this palette. I think the colors in here are really pretty, and for a pastel palette, there's actually quite a bit of depth. I just realized that I have more Sydney Grace. They were just on a different shelf. I actually purchased all of the Sydney Grace X Temptalia palettes that were released last year. This is the On the Horizon palette. I love this palette. I love the color story of these. They're very, very grungy and they have beautiful, beautiful shimmer shades. This is the Quintessence palette. This one also very, very beautiful. I, again, love all the fun colors. And then lastly in that series was the Radiant Reflection, and this is a little bit more of their jewel toned palette. Really, these shades down here are absolutely positively stunning. These palettes I find myself reaching for a lot. Now moving into my massive, massive, massive ColourPop collection. I actually decluttered quite a few ColourPop palettes over the last couple of years, but I am keeping the Tinkerbell palette. This was released last year, and this was the palette people just raved about with ColourPop. I like it, but I don't think it's as amazing as people like to say. I definitely want to keep it through one more year to see if I reach for it. Then we have the That's Taupe palette. I love this palette. It is very much a cool toned neutral palette, but I love it. And whenever I'm thinking of cool tone neutrals, I'm instantly wanting to pick this one up. You can see I've got some dips going. That's how much love I give this palette. This is the Mandalorian palette. This is their little collab with Star Wars. These are really pretty. Again, pretty neutral, cool tone palettes. I haven't reached for these for a hot minute, so I'm going to see again if I end up reaching for these this next year, and if not, these probably won't make it through the next declutter. Same goes with the Child palette, which again was part of their Star Wars collab. I actually like the color story of this one a lot though, with those greens, and I do like how deep the colors go too, so you can just create some really beautiful looks. I do have a couple of their plastic 9-pan palettes. I did only keep the ones that I really like. And this is the Orchid Unite. You guys, I haven't even used this. I bought this palette because I've heard it's amazing and I haven't used this. So this needs to go on my vanity so that it can get used in the next couple of days. Next is Going Coconuts. This is just another little palette that I can't get rid of. It's still that whole cool tone, neutral dream. And you can see I've given this palette a lot of love too, and will continue to reach for this one, I'm sure. I actually just did a look with the Blowing Smoke palette this last week. I love this for just a dark, deep kind of black gray smoky eye. This is the one I instantly want to reach for. The Of Quartz palette I really really like this one too. I've only used this once. Like I said, I am getting more into cool tones, so I'm wanting to reach for these a little bit more, but I love the color story of this one, and the formula is really nice. The Witching Hour palette, which was last year's Halloween release with Hocus Pocus. You're gonna see a lot of Hocus Pocus palettes in here because ColourPop has released quite a few. I really like this palette. I used this year to create a fun Halloween look. So Gather Round Sisters was the first year they released their Hocus Pocus collection. So the one I just showed you was the second. This was the first. This I did not get when it first released, but I bought it on a really good sale, and I do like this palette a lot. I think this is a beautiful color story. I love the neutral with the pop of pink. And then finally, this year's Hocus Pocus. This is the It's All Hallows Eve palette. This one is my all-time favorite. This is the one I reach for the most. This is the one that immediately makes me want to create eye looks. The looks I did with this palette were so incredibly fun. I have quite a few makeup tutorials on my channel. I will link my makeup tutorial playlist down below for you. So this palette released this year to the Clay It Cool, and I almost didn't buy this palette, but let me just tell you, I actually really enjoy this neutral palette. I love the terracotta tones of this, and I just really have loved all the looks that I've created. This one was a pleasant surprise. Plush Like Me is a palette that was released that I picked up. I don't know why. I've only used this palette a couple of times. It did make it through my declutter this year, but this is another one that if I'm not reaching for it this next year, I'm going to declutter it. It's honestly just not a color story that inspires me. Also on a really good sale, I picked up the Powerpuff Girls palette. I have not even used this one. This is on my radar to definitely get some love out of it this summer. The colors are just really bright and fun and perfect for spring or summer. I also heard that the formula in this palette is really good. This year I picked up the Troublemaker, and I love this palette. I did a whole tutorial review here on my channel, and this palette blew me away. The cool toned neutrals in here with the pinks are absolutely beautiful, and the looks that I created I really, really love. This is a great smoky eye palette. The Misunderstood palette, this one I picked up on sale, and I really love this palette. I've used this a ton, and this is one that I see on my shelf and instantly get inspired by. I just really, really love the color story. Last year I bought the Nightmare Before Christmas palette. The packaging of this is so much fun, and the color story equally as fun. It is purples, it is pinks, it's some deep, dark, kind of grungy neutrals. This palette is another really fun one to use. California Love was one of the first ColourPop palettes that I bought. It's very, very neutral, but I'll tell you, whenever I think neutral, I want to pick up this palette. I really, really love this. This is another one I've taken traveling just because it is so neutral, compact, and there's just a lot of looks that you can create. Last year's Christmas release was the Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer palette. Now, I keep this palette mainly for nostalgia. I don't think that the formula is that great in here. The color story is very Christmassy, very fun. I may actually use this. I actually did use this holiday season, but the formula of this one isn't my favorite. But like I said, I want to keep it for nostalgia. We'll see if I reach for this again. The At Forest Sight palette, which was done with Raw Beauty Christie. I have never used this palette. I only bought this palette because I had mega FOMO when I saw it and felt like I had missed out, but I love the color story. I just have not reached for it. This is another one that's making its way to my use pile on my vanity. The Lush Life palette, this is one of the best ones ColourPop has put out pretty much ever. The color story of this is incredible. The quality of this is incredible. I have used this palette so many times and it still makes me want to reach for it. I also love the Barbie palette. This is another one that they collabed with the Barbie franchise, but put out just a really great palette. This is 100% a go-to summer palette for me. It was actually featured in my top palettes for summer video. I just love everything about it. Next up is the Good as Gold palette. I actually just bought this and I have not even used it yet, but I wanted a gold neutral palette. I don't know why, but I felt like that was something missing in my collection, and I believe that it is. I just for some reason haven't reached for this, but I'm excited to test it out. I also have a few quads. I actually really enjoy the formula of their quads. This is their Scorpio quad. I bought this because I'm a Scorpio, so I had to have it. I actually have all the original packaging. I've used this palette and it's really nice. Next up is is the Emerald Away. This is another really pretty palette. I love green eyeshadow, and this is one that I find creates really simple but beautiful looks. The Sorbet palette, this is one I almost decluttered this year and then stopped myself, only because it is just a very berry toned, kind of light neutral palette. These are just excellent to take for travel, especially with the nice plastic packaging. And last but not least for quads is the Waffle Cone. I love the color story of this. I just couldn't get rid of it. I have not reached for this in a long time, but like I said, I do really love how unique the color story is. Next are my BH palettes. I'm so sad that BH is now owned by Makeup Revolution. I have not purchased anything since they sold to them. These are all from last year. This was their Birthstone series that they did last year, and I did declutter a few of them, just kept my favorites. I really like the Diamond because it is that cool tone, kind of smoky eye. I also have the Peridot palette because I love the really fun green color story. Same reason I kept the Emerald palette, not to mention the quality of the old BH palettes are so good. This one is really fun. This is my go-to St. Patrick's Day palette. The Citrine is my birthstone, so I had to keep it, but I also just love the yellow mustard brown color story. For me, if I'm gonna do a brown neutral look, I love it with yellow. One of my favorite combinations. I also kept the Sapphire palette because it's absolutely stunning, and the quality of this is amazing. The quality of all of these BH palettes is so amazing. And then lastly, for the Birthstone series, I kept Turquoise. Now this one's not my favorite, but I wanna give it a little bit more love, so I kept it through this year's declutter. Before they went out of business or sold to Makeup Revolution, I grabbed a few palettes on a crazy sale, and one of those was the Absinthe palette. I really like the color story of this. It is very green leaning, but it does have some interesting greens. I definitely need to use this a little bit more. In fact, I don't think that I've ever used this. So this, again, going in the to use pile. And when I purchased the Absinthe palette, I picked up Venom just because I really like that whole cool toned color story. Cool tones are kind of becoming my jam, so I'm excited to try this one out. I've actually never applied this one to my eyes either. Now we have a few of their more colorful palettes. This is the F Off palette. I love the color story of this, so I had to have it. I've used this a few times. Such a beautiful palette, such a beautiful color story, and such a beautiful formula. From that same line, I have the Do Not Disturb. This is probably, honestly, my favorite color story out of those kind of raunchy palettes that they released a couple, I think last year. This color story is so fun. I have created just some really fun looks with this. And lastly, I have the Let That S Go palette. This one I've never used, but I had to pick it up on a sale because the color story, the greens, the browns, I was excited about it. I guess I have quite a few palettes that need to go on my vanity. I have the Avocado Toast palette from their brunch series. I absolutely love this palette. I love the color story. Every single look I've created with this has been amazing. I actually bought this palette for a friend. That is how much I love it. And this is the amazing BH formula. I have the Smitten in Switzerland. This is actually the palette I have on my eyes today. Also really love this color story, very cool toned, very beautiful. And the Blueberry Muffin palette. This is kind of what started it all with BH Cosmetics. This is the palette that people bought and the formula blew them away and BH just took off like crazy. One of my all-time favorite palettes in my collection. From their travel series, I have just a couple. I have the Puerto Rico palette, which is very much their neutral palette. I kept this because I like the oranges and the reds in this, and it's just a really good formula. So I wanted to keep a neutral palette from BH. But from the travel series, Paris, 1,000,000 gazillion % my favorite. This palette got so much hype. So many great things were said about this palette for good reason. This is probably one of the best formulas aside from my Unearthly palettes that I have. I have 3 of their palettes from their Sweet Shop collection. I think I'm missing 2, the red toned one and the neutral one, but I do have the Cotton Candy and I really like this. This is another palette that just has such a great formula. The shimmers in here are absolutely incredible, like seen from space, incredible. Of course, I have the Bubblegum palette because this is the blue leaning palette and I love her. I love the blues in here. And again, that shimmer, the shimmers in here are so fantastic. And last from Sweet Shop is Pistachio. This is one that I get the most use out of because this is their green palette. Every time I wear this palette, it's another one I get a lot of compliments on because the shimmers in these palettes, they are so flaky and beautiful. I mean, absolutely stunning. And lastly from BH is their Lit List palette. This was their holiday release last year, again, before they sold to Makeup Revolution. Quality of this one, 1,000,000 out of 10. This is my go-to Christmas palette every year. I have worn this on my eyes for Christmas ever since I got it. There's one pressed glitter in this palette, this kind of red one in the middle, and it's actually really nice for a pressed glitter. So this palette is a go-to for me. I missed a Glam Light palette because it was on the wrong shelf. This is the Michaela Pat 2 palette. This was actually released just this year. I do not have the Part 1 palette. I did not pick that up, but I'm really happy I picked this one up. The formula in here is fantastic. I love all the green shades. I have gotten a lot of use out of this one. My one and only Lunar Beauty palette, I actually decluttered my Lunar Eclipse because I never used it, but this is the Nude Prism palette, and this is the Lunar Beauty palette he released this year, his neutral palette. The shimmers in here are what keeps this palette in my collection. They are so icy and beautiful and flawless. Not to mention the mattes are great as well. This is another one of those neutral palettes with a twist. My Pat McGrath collection is very, very small. I have this one palette, and the only reason I even own this palette is because I got it on a huge, huge sale. I would never pay Pat McGrath prices. I do not think the formula is worth the price that she charges. So I kept this palette because I like it. I don't love it. And it's my only Pat McGrath, and honestly will probably be my only Pat McGrath. Okay, back to Lunar Beauty. I need to organize my shelves, clearly. I forgot that I bought his Advent Calendar palette. This is the 12 Days of Lunar. This was the palette that was in his Advent Calendar this year. And this is a beautiful, beautiful fall palette. Definitely not what was expected from the front of it. That was what people were complaining about. But it is a really, really beautiful palette and a really nice, just typical Lunar Beauty formula. My one and only palette from Kaleidos is the Flower Punk palette. I actually like Kaleidos for some reason though. I just don't buy their palettes. So I need to put them on my radar for this next year. I love the Flower Punk palette. Absolutely love it. Moving on to Huda Beauty, I don't have a lot left. I don't think she has the best formula, so I only kept the palettes I really enjoy. I love the Jaguar palette from her Wild collection that she released this last year. This is actually a really pretty palette. It applies beautifully to the eyes and is definitely a unique color story for Huda Beauty. I also kept their brown palette. She put this out, I think, last year. The formula of this one is pretty decent, and I wanted to have a small, compact, neutral palette. And then this one came out this year. This is the Love Fest. And again, I kept this palette because it's actually a nice formula. I really like this middle shimmer shade. And what's great about this palette is the uniqueness of the color story, again, for Huda. Now, these two palettes I love. This is the Rose Quartz palette. Oh my gosh, I love everything about this palette. I have used this palette so much, and I absolutely love it. This one will never leave my collection. And same with Mercury Retrograde. I actually bought this on a really, really discounted sale, and I love it. Again, uniqueness for her, and the formula of these bigger palettes is exceptional. Now, two palettes from Gimme Glow. This is another brand that's on my radar for this next year. I have the Juicy Olive, and I love it. I love, love, love this palette. I reach for this palette a lot. I love the monochromatic kind of olivey green grungy color story. And then I actually picked up the Nightlife palette this year. There were two that were released, and I decided to go with the more purpley periwinkle color story. I love this yellow that's in here. Absolutely beautiful. I actually really like this palette. It is a little bit dusty, so you have to tap off your brush, but very, very pigmented and very fun to use. I own one Tarte palette. Tarte, not my favorite for eyeshadow, but this Maneater palette, this came out just a few months ago. This palette I love. I actually took this palette to Hawaii, and I love it. I love it. It is neutral, 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 but there are so many textures and twists to this palette. If Tarte puts out more palettes to the quality of this one, I'll be adding more to my collection. I also only have two Too Faced palettes, another brand that I just don't love. I have the Christmas Coffee palette. This palette actually came out last year, and I like this. I actually wore this just the other day. It's definitely neutral with one green shade. And then they put out the Major Love, and it looks pretty similar to the Christmas Coffee, not gonna gonna lie, I mean, we have the one green shade and lots of neutral, but I do find myself reaching for these two palettes, and I like that they're just small little 8-pan palettes. Next up, I have a couple of palettes from SheGlam. This is Shein's makeup line. I actually really like the quality of these. I just don't own a lot of them. This was their Scorpio palette. I am a Scorpio, so I picked this up for that reason, but it's actually really nice quality, and all of these palettes are like $6 or $7. And this is the Wolf Calls palette. I actually did a full face of SheGlam and used this palette. It is such a pretty blue, cool toned palette. Really, really nice quality, like I said, and really, really affordable. I actually have more Too Faced palettes, just two more. Those small little ones were on a top shelf. These are on the bottom shelf. I have the Cinnamon Swirl palette from last year. This is pretty. It's a neutral palette. It smells really good. It kind of smells like cinnamon. It is one that I will reach for when I'm looking for that kind of neutral look. And then I have the Sweet Peach palette. I received this in a subscription box and was pleasantly surprised at how much I like this. This also smells really good. This one's been really fun to create looks with. It is neutral, but there's some fun pops of color and some peach, which give it a little bit of variety. This year, I've recently discovered Rashbi Cosmetics. I've been getting the palettes in my Slay Glam box, and let me just tell you how amazing the quality is. Every month that I get a palette, I get really excited. So this first one is the Bonfire palette. This, again, came in Slay Glam box. I'm sure that Rashbi Cosmetics has a website, but I've really been loving them, getting them in my Slay Glam box. I think I have 4 palettes now, and I love all of them. Here's another one. This is the Be Beautiful palette, and this is a entire duochrome palette. So all the shades in here are duochromes. Really, really, really nice quality. And we actually got the Be Beautiful 2 palette, which is this one here. And again, it is all those really, really pretty duochromes. I wore this palette yesterday, and they are just such phenomenal quality. And then lastly from Rashbi, this came in this month's Slay Glam box. This is the Christmas Wishes palette. This is in collaboration with Just Anne here on YouTube. This is a really pretty palette. I wore this to a Christmas party and love, love, love my look and can't wait to use it again. 2 palettes from LA Girl. This is a great affordable drugstore brand. This is the Hey Hey Vacay, and this one is the Under the Palms palette. I decluttered my Tan Lines palette because I decided just to keep this one because it's definitely more of a color story that I gravitate towards with the neutrals and all of the greens. The quality of LA Girl is really nice. And then I also have the Main Stage Desert Dream. I will never get rid of this palette because the quality again is amazing, and I just love the fun color story. Now my Jaclyn Hill palettes. I decluttered the volume 2, but this is the volume 1 Jaclyn Hill palette. This is honestly just the one I reach for more. It's just more neutral with a few pops of color. And when I think of my big Jaclyn Hill palettes, I'm really looking for more neutral. Next up is the Armed and Dangerous. I have never used this palette. I think I bought this at TJ Maxx or Marshall's. I think the color story is really pretty. I definitely want to try it out. I have heard kind of hit and miss things about it. Strawberry Feels palette. I really love this palette. I have worn this a lot. She actually released this palette this year. I will say the shimmers aren't the most amazing, sparkly, beautiful shimmers, but they pair really nicely with the mattes. The mattes are really nice, and I've created some really fun looks with this. She also released the Divine Neutrals palette, I think last year, and I really, really like this palette much, much more than I thought that I would. Again, very, very neutral, but the formula in here I feel like is really nice. And then lastly, this year she released the Dear Mom palette. This was in collaboration with her mom, Robin. Again, a very, very, very neutral palette, but I really like the formula. This is another one that some people love and some people don't, but for me, this is one I reach for a lot. Moving on to Juvia's Place, I have just a few palettes. I have the Rebel Grays, and I like this palette. When I want a gray tone smoky eye, this is the only one that I reach for. The quality of Juvia's Place is nice, and they are very, very, very pigmented. This is a brand new release from her. This is the Fula palette. Oh my, is this a beautiful palette. I had so much fun playing with this. Really, really nice quality, very pigmented, and a fun color story. The Chocolates, I really like this for neutral. Again, if I am thinking of just a neutral brown palette, I have used this one several times. I think the quality is amazing, and I like that it goes from light to mid-tone to deep. I also really love the Nubian Royal. In fact, I like her little 6-pan kind of monochromatic palettes like this one in the chocolates. This is a beautiful, beautiful purple monochromatic color story. Festival by Juvia's Place. I don't know that I've ever used this. No, I have not. I have only swatched this palette. I do think that it is really, really pretty though, and I definitely want to give it some love. I also really appreciate kind of the big pans in this palette. And then lastly, I have the Nubian 2. This is my last palette from Juvia's Place. And again, I really like the color story of this one as well. Neutral with a twist. I have 2 palettes from the Illuminati brand. Now, I've been receiving these in subscription boxes as well. This may have come in an advent calendar. This is the Isabel Bedoya palette. So it was a collab palette, and I used this just the other day and really, really liked my look. This is a really, really beautiful, beautiful palette and excellent quality. And then I have this little quad, and this came in a subscription box. I just love the colors, the teal and gray. I've used this as well and really like it. They are all shimmer shades though, so you just pair this with your favorite matte palette, and we know mine is the Blend Bunny. Now moving on to brands that I have just one palette of, and I'm going to start with all of my single shadows. These are all Terra Moon Cosmetics shadows, and I love these. These are all pretty duochromes. I don't reach for single shadows a lot, so I have not added any recently to my collection. I definitely need to pull these out more because they are beautiful. And my other little singles are all from JD Glow. That's a really affordable kind of duochrome, multi-chrome brand. These are so beautiful. Again, I just need to reach for them more. My only Urban Decay palette is Urban Decay Naked Honey. I just do not love Urban Decay. For some reason, their color stories don't entice me at all, but I do love this mustardy brown one. The Poison Ivy palette is a collaboration with Milan Rowe and Doodles by the Bunny on Instagram. I really like her. She's very creative, and she put together a beautiful palette. Very green leaning with a pop of purple, pop of red. The formula, I was surprised, is as incredible as it is. I'd never tried Milan Rowe before, but if they release anything else, I'm definitely interested. I recently picked up the Notoriously Morbid Rusted Essence. I have seen Notoriously Morbid time and time again on my Instagram feed, and it always entices me, but I've never purchased anything from the brand. But when they released this palette, I had to have it. I bought this during the fall, and it is the epitome of a fall palette. The formula, amazing. Can't wait to see what else they come out with. The only ABH palette I own, I've decluttered all of the rest. This is the Norvina Volume something or another, Volume 3. And I like this palette because of all the oranges in it. And I actually took this palette on vacation, was able to create just a ton of looks with it. So if I want just a really fun, colorful palette, the nice hard packaging makes it great for travel. And I actually really enjoy the formula. My only Sugar Drizzle palette, they are 100% on my radar. This is the MILF palette, or the Man I Love Frogs. This is another beautiful all shimmer special shade palette. It is incredible, absolutely incredible. I can't wait to see what they come out with this next year because, like I said, this is a brand I need more of. I have this little bento box from Kaja. This is the Chocolate Dahlia. This is the only Kaja eyeshadow palette that I have. It's one of those little stackable ones, and honestly, I really like this palette. I think the colors in here are really pretty, and I've created some really fun looks with it. And then I have this 5-pan palette from Loha Beauty. I love their lashes. We get those a lot in Lashy Box, and one month they sent us this green palette. This is beautiful. The one time I've worn this, lots of compliments. It's very easy to put together a pretty monochromatic look. And my one and only Ofra palette, this is the collaboration with Leora here on YouTube. I picked it up because Leora is one of the beauty YouTubers that I really, really enjoy, and this is the palette that she created with Ofra. It is quite the interesting color story, but believe it or not, you can have some really fun looks with this. My only little e.l.f. palette too that I have left in my collection is this little bite-size berry palette. This is so pretty. This came in my e.l.f. advent calendar, and I really like it, so I'm gonna keep it especially for all drugstore makeup tutorials. Another little fun 5-pan palette. This is from the Beauty Crop. This is called the Vitamin Babe. It is a very orange 5-pan neutral palette, but I love orange. As you guys know, this is a color story I reach for a lot, and for Beauty Crop, the formula is very nice. The Spellbook from Rude Cosmetics. This palette has gotten a lot of love. I think Rude Cosmetics is underrated. It's a small indie brand. I actually see them a lot in TJ Maxx, but this palette, I love it. I love the color story. I have used this doing people's makeup several times and everyone just really loves it. Really nice formula as well. My one and only Fenty Beauty palette. I don't really love Fenty's eyeshadow formula. However, I do love this little number 6 palette. Cool toned, neutrals. This is a really easy palette to create pretty looks with. And my only Makeup Revolution palette that I have is the Mini Tasty Avocado. I just love the color story of this, and honestly, excellent formula. I use this a lot in full faces of drugstore makeup, and this is one I actually reach for. And again, my only Revolution product. And then from Cash Beauty, I have the Color Trip palette. This is my only palette from the brand. I don't even know if they're still around or if they're still releasing palettes, but I do really like this one. This whole bottom row down here is cake liners. I don't use those, but as far as the formula and the colors of the rest of the palette, I really, really love this. This fun palette is actually a collab between Gourmand Girls and Saints Angel Sinners. This is the Together palette. I got this in a subscription box and I love this palette. The special shades in here, the shimmers, are incredible. The mattes are buttery, blend beautifully. I definitely want more in my collection from both Gourmand Girls and Saints Angel Sinners. From Lois Cosmetics, I have the Meet Me in the Underworld palette. This palette is incredible. One of my all-time favorite palettes in my collection, not gonna lie. I paid a pretty penny for this. This is about a $70 eyeshadow palette, but it's so nice. I know they released a second palette this year that didn't get very good reviews. I'm glad I didn't pick that up, but this is one that I use all the time and one of my favorites in my collection. Next up is the Perception palette from Midas Cosmetics. Midas Cosmetics is no longer around, but I really like this palette. It's the only one I have from the brand. I like the color story. It's very unique, very different. It can be hard to put looks together, but whenever I do, the quality is so nice and the looks come out beautiful. From Mora Beauty, I have the Melancholy palette. Now, I originally bought this for the cause. They were donating, I think, to some type of sea or animal related charity, and I loved the color story, and this is a really nice palette. I'd be interested in buying more from the brand. I don't know if they're still around or if they're releasing, but this is a palette I really enjoy. And last but not least, I cannot believe we're done. I have the Metamorphosis palette from Pink Crush Cosmetics. Again, the only palette I have from the brand, but this is a brand that I see their releases and my mouth drops. So I'm definitely picking up more this next year. The quality of this and the color story, I love it.